Welcome to the History of North America. I'm Mark Vinette. The glorious era that was Tudor England helped shape the early exploration and colonization of the North American continent. Join me as we continue a deep dive into Tudor England and its great transatlantic explorers. King Henry VIII is probably the most well-known and most studied of English monarchs. His reign is often seen as a prelude to and the forerunner of the British Empire and English activities on the North American continent. Certainly, without the institutional changes he brought, the wars he fought, and the religious differences he ushered into his country, England, and therefore Britain, likely would have never risen to the status she ultimately achieved. His life was rocked by repeated scandals, religious schisms, and lustful ambition, making King Henry VIII one of the most fascinating and mixed characters to influence North America's history.
Henry VIII is probably the best-known King of England, and may even be the most notorious, though there are plenty to compete for that title. Some may argue he was also the most important King of England because of the status which he brought to his kingdom, along with the establishment of the Church of England. Certainly, his reign saw some of the most significant developments in England since the time of Edward I. Henry was not born to be king. As a younger son of Henry VII, he had been groomed for the church, receiving a substantial classical education. However, Henry's elder brother Arthur died of consumption, and Henry, still only 10, became heir apparent. Unlike his father, who was reserved and surly, Henry was a happy child who delighted in all manner of sports and entertainment. Not only did he master French and Latin, and became an excellent rider and athlete, but he was a fine dancer and musician. The music of Greensleeves has long been attributed to him. He also had a natural authority and self-command, and enjoyed touring England and presenting himself to his subjects, which made him a very popular prince and king. Although the nickname Bluff King Hal was only accorded to him posthumously, it fitted his character well. Moreover, unlike his predecessors for the past 100 years, and arguably longer, Henry was the first to inherit a comparatively united kingdom as an assured successor with every right of inheritance to the throne. His father had established good relationships with the leading countries of Europe, and with no foreign wars for some years, the country's finances were strong. England was in the best shape financially, spiritually, and administratively that it had been for a long time. Henry was 2 months off his 18th birthday when his father died. He was a handsome, well-proportioned youth, in love with life and the world. He happily obeyed his father's dying wish that he marry his elder brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, in order to continue the alliance with Spain. They were married 6 weeks later, and 2 weeks after that there was a double coronation in Westminster Abbey at the height of midsummer, with much feasting and merrymaking. Henry was more interested in enjoying himself than bothering with the day-to-day affairs of government. He satisfied himself that his ministers could be trusted, and left the overall direction of affairs to William Warham, Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, later the 2nd Duke of Norfolk, who was the Lord Treasurer, Bishop Richard Fox, and after 1514 to Thomas Wolsey. Henry rid the court of Edmund Dudley and Sir Richard Empson, 2 key ministers in Henry VII's reign, who were the architects of a strict tax regime and had become hated by the populace. Henry had them executed on the grounds of constructive treason, as they had sought to arm their men as Henry VII lay dying. Henry preferred to involve himself in European affairs, playing the role of an international magnate not confined to an English backwater. He supported his father-in-law Ferdinand of Aragon against the Moors in 1511 and joined Pope Julius II, along with Venice and Spain, in the Holy League against France, which was formed that October. This increased the friction between England and Scotland, France's old ally, which was exacerbated by border skirmishes and sea raids. James IV of Scotland, who was Henry's brother-in-law, insisted that, if Henry remained part of the Holy League, the only outcome could be war between Scotland and England. Henry seemed undisturbed. In June 1513, Henry led an invasion force to Calais. James IV took advantage to invade England, something Henry had anticipated, and so dispatched Thomas Howard to counter. The result was the Battle of Flodden on the 9th of September 1513, where James IV and the flower of Scottish nobility fell. Since the heir, James V, was only a year old, Henry's sister, Margaret, became the Scottish regent. She did not receive the support of the Scottish aristocracy, but for a period, although skirmishes continued, the battle with Scotland was won, and Henry was victorious. He was also victorious in France, leading the successful sieges of Terouanne and Tournai, whilst his forces defeated the French at the Battle of the Spurs at Guinegate on the 16th of August 1513. The name of the battle signified the speed of the French retreat. Thomas Wolsey negotiated peace terms with France, one of the terms being the marriage of Henry's sister Mary to Louis XII of France in August 1514. The marriage was short-lived as Louis died only a few months later. Mary then angered Henry by running away with his close friend Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, and marrying in secret in February 1515. They were eventually pardoned upon payment of an exacting fine, and they would subsequently become the grandparents of the ill-fated Lady Jane Grey. Henry wanted to be the centre of the European stage. When the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I died in January 1519, Henry stood as a candidate to succeed him, having earlier been encouraged by Maximilian himself, who regarded him as a good prospect. However, the electors selected from the controlling Habsburg family. When Pope Leo X died in December 1521, Henry strove to have an English pope, nominating Thomas Wolsey, but without success. Europe seemed a world closed to Henry, and it frustrated him that a man of his abilities was denied greater influence in European affairs. It was probably this attitude that shaped his dealings with the new French king François. In June 1520, Wolsey was able to engineer a summit meeting at Guines near Calais, which became known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold because of the extravagance of the display, each party trying to outshine the other. Another peace treaty was negotiated, though it too was short-lived. This period was one of change in Europe. Most significant, as far as England was concerned, was the reforming zeal of the German scholar and preacher Martin Luther, who began a prolonged series of attacks upon the papacy and the Catholic Church, including his book On the Babylonish Captivity of the Church in 1520. Henry had remained a staunch supporter of the Pope and felt compelled to respond to Luther's attacks. Together with Thomas More and John Fisher, Henry wrote Defence of the Seven Sacraments, which became a bestseller throughout Europe. In recognition of his support, the Pope conferred on Henry in 1521 the title of Fidei Defensor, or Defender of the Faith, a title which has been used by all subsequent English monarchs, regardless of their faith. Within a few years, it would seem a singularly inappropriate title for Henry. He was becoming increasingly concerned about the birth of an heir. His wife, Catherine, had borne him 6 children, but only one of these, Mary, had survived infancy. His eldest son, Henry, born in 1511, had died after only 7 weeks. Their last-born child died within hours of its birth in November 1518. By 1526, when Catherine had turned 40, it was evident that Henry would not have a son. It was unthinkable that he would be succeeded by a girl. He began to believe that the fault lay with him and that he had committed a sin against the Church in marrying his brother's widow, even though the marriage had received papal blessing. It was especially galling, as in June 1519, Henry's mistress, Elizabeth Blount, who was only 17, had borne him a baby boy, who became Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond. Although illegitimate, Henry began to regard this boy as his likely heir if he were unable to produce a legitimate child. Also, by 1527, Henry had become infatuated with the 25-year-old Anne Boleyn, whose elder sister, Mary, had been Henry's mistress for some years. Anne refused to be simply his mistress and played for higher stakes. Wolsey entered into negotiations with the Pope formally to annul Henry's marriage with Catherine. The new Pope, Clement VII, was traditional in his outlook and a vehement opposer of Lutheranism. At first it looked as if he might accommodate Henry, but the Pope then succumbed to the power of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was the nephew of Henry's wife. Clement refused to accept that his predecessor's dispensation for Henry's marriage could have been in error, yet whilst he did not reject Henry's request outright, he procrastinated in every way possible, setting up a commission to review the issue. The affair dragged on for 6 years, during which time Clement was seen by more and more countries as a weak pope. The whole of Scandinavia broke with Rome and introduced Lutheranism, beginning in 1527. Henry's advisor, Thomas Cromwell, advised the same. His inability to resolve the matter had seen Wolsey fall from power. He was arrested for treason in November 1530, but died soon after. Cromwell now moved matters ahead, and it was under his guidance that Henry became the head of a separate Church of England, with the authority to appoint his own archbishops and bishops. Thomas Cranmer, his newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, pronounced on the 23rd of May 1533 that Henry's marriage with Catherine was void. Henry had already taken this as read, as he had secretly wedded Anne Boleyn in January 1533, when she was already a month pregnant. The Pope refused to accept the pronouncement, and in July 1533 he declared the divorce and remarriage void and prepared to excommunicate Henry. The excommunication was suspended, but it was reaffirmed by Clement's successor, Paul III, who was however unable to gain the international support he desired to formalise the sentence. This merely served to force Henry further down his chosen road, rather than allow for reconciliation. In fact, Henry was at great pains to demonstrate that his argument was only against the Pope, not the Church. The significant change was that Henry was head of the Church in his dominions, or, like the Pope, God's representative. Otherwise, changes were limited, and Henry emphasised this with the publication of the Act of the Six Articles in 1539, which reaffirmed doctrines inherited from the Church of Rome. Nevertheless, there were those who could not support Henry in his role as head of the Church, such as Sir Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher, who refused to acknowledge this and were executed in 1535.
Thomas More gave us the term utopia in the early 16th century, and 20th century authors have challenged his premise by fictionally creating the dystopia, often characterized by rampant fear or distress, tyrannical governments, environmental disaster, or other characteristics associated with a cataclysmic decline in society. Early European colonization and settlement of North America ushered in the realization of utopian ideals or dystopian nightmares. One person's utopia is another person's dystopia. This has been true throughout history, including when the old world and the new collided starting in the late 15th century. A dystopia, or anti-utopia, is a fictional community or society that is undesirable or frightening. It is often treated as an antonym of utopia, a term that was coined by Sir Thomas More and figures as the title of his best-known work, published in 1516, which created a blueprint for an ideal society with minimal crime, violence, and poverty. The relationship between utopia and dystopia is more complex than this, however, as utopian elements are found in many dystopias, and vice versa. Many early settlers to North America envisaged the creation of a utopian society, an ideal place, paradise, city upon a hill, heaven on earth, new Garden of Eden, with idyllic religious, social, and political customs. This misplaced faith in political utopias, however, sometimes led to failure and ruin during the nascent North American colonization process. Next time, we continue our short biography of Henry VIII.